I'm the director of the John C. West Forum on Politics and Policy and the co-director of the Human Experience course here at Winthrop. I'd like to ask all of you first if you could please make sure that your cell phones or your laptops are on silent or something that won't make noise during the event, please. We here at Winthrop are happy to welcome our speaker, Dr. Tim Shaffer, to our campus this evening to speak with us about the dynamics of civil discourse in American civic life. I dare say we could all learn something about better communication with those with whom we do not see eye to eye. So I thank all of you for coming. Dr. Shaffer is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies and an assistant director of the Institute for Civic Discourse and Democracy at Kansas State University. He earned his PhD at Cornell University, an MPA and an MA at the University of Dayton, and a BA at St. Bonaventure University.
That's good.
As a scholar, Dr. Shaffer centers his research on the advancement of democratic practices by focusing on deliberative democracy, civic education, and small group communication, with a concentration on the role of civic professionals in institutional settings, such as higher education, NGOs, and the government. He routinely presents at conferences and offers workshops exploring themes of civic engagement, civil discourse, and deliberative dialogue. He has authored numerous books, 4 of which are behind me here, and if you would like to take a look at them after the event or buy them, you're certainly welcome to, or just even take a look at them. 2 of his most recent books are Deliberative Pedagogy, Teaching and Learning for Democratic Engagement, and A Crisis of Civility, Political Discourse and Its Discontents. Dr. Shaffer is also Principal Research Specialist with the National Institute for Civil Discourse at the University of Arizona. Connected to these efforts, Dr. Shaffer also serves as the Associate Editor of the Journal of Public Deliberation, as a country expert on deliberative democracy and the Varieties of Democracy Institute Research Project, and as a co-director guiding the work of the Deliberative Pedagogy Lab, an international project focused on applied scholarship about the ways that deliberation can transform higher education, educational approaches, and the environment. So let's all give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. That's good. Let me just switch something real fast because I didn't do that. All right, well, it's really wonderful to be here. Thanks for coming out tonight. So, yay, President's Day. So let me get a sense of kind of who's in the room here. So how many of you are students here at Winthrop? Can you, look at your hands. Very nice. All right. How many of you are faculty or staff here at the university? Not nearly as many hands. And broader community beyond campus? All right. Well, good. Thanks for being here. So tonight, I want to do a couple things. One is really to explore kind of the state of what is referred to here as kind of civil discourse and kind of unpack that, understand what that means. And then also how it relates to this sense of, well, if that's true, and it seems like it probably is, what can we do about it, or what ought we do about it, all right? So I want to kind of get us going in that direction. But I want to start here, right, at your place. This is legitimately your campus, right? I stole this from the internet. Okay. Sometimes the internet, it's kind of like Wikipedia. Don't use it for lots of things, but every once in a while it is helpful. I have these 2 questions for everybody. And this is not you're not going to yell it out right now, but I do want you to capture it in some way. So if you are a diligent person with some note-taking ability, whether it's paper or otherwise, take just a second for this question. What is the purpose of education? What does it mean? Why are you here? You might have lots of reasons. And depending on who you are and those types of things, you might have a different response. So, what's the purpose of education? And then the second one, how do you, and I'm literally talking about this for you individually, and then also collectively, we'll talk about that later. How do you kind of create space for democracy, whatever in the world that means, at Winthrop? All right, so what's the purpose of education? and how do you kind of create space for democracy? However you understand that or think about it right now, okay? So just a second. How have you helped make these practices, these democratic ideas flourish on campus or beyond? Okay? You didn't know this was going to be interactive, did you? All right. So, we're going to talk about politics to some extent, right? And so, fairly familiar images. Who wants to vote on that picture on the left? What is that? What is that place? Huh? Somebody mumbled something. Yeah, Congress. Oh, yeah. We'll take both answers. Good job. I didn't see exactly who said it. Right. So politics can be thought about in these ways. Totally appropriate and part of our context and background. A big part of tonight actually is going to be thinking about democracy and politics that looks a little bit more like something like this. All right. So it's not to dismiss or exclude the idea of, and you all seem to be very popular as it relates to political candidates in the past and it seems like these days as an environment where they appropriately want to be able to speak to you and to lots of other audiences. And so you have a sense of that, right? What we're going to talk about tonight is really unpacking a little bit of this. You may have seen this image. This is old, relatively old, so I apologize for the grainy nature. Has anybody seen this before, right? What do we want? Respectful discourse. When do we want it, right? Now would be agreeable, but let's talk about it. And so there's this sense, and part of our thinking, especially tonight, these kinds of questions, right? How do we kind of confront a space where that almost seems laughable, right? Or, as we kind of see here from this wonderful New Yorker cartoon, right? It's not about the kind of information or the accuracy that we might have, but it's usually about who's the loudest, who's most present in whatever ways we might be thinking about that. So, who am I? And Katerina just said a little bit of this. So I'm a professor, so I hang out with lots of folks, your counterparts in the state of Kansas, at Kansas State University. And wonderfully have the opportunity to explore those questions in classrooms, but also in community ways. So we have an Institute for Civic Discourse and Democracy that trains teachers locally, also across the state, faculty, staff at the university, and also for students to learn how to facilitate some of these skills and practices. And we're going to kind of come back to this question about what you can do as it relates to this work. And then the National Institute for Civic Discourse play a role with kind of this research arm of what do we even understand or think about these questions and ideas. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. So these were kind of referenced. And so it's a lot about teaching these ideas and practices and also kind of wrestling with that sense of what does it mean. I use this language of a civic professional. Right? How do we use technical, and a lot of you, if you're students, you're here to gain degrees, right? I'm assuming you're working towards completion of something, right? So the idea of having technical knowledge in whatever those fields and areas wed with that sense of kind of a civic purpose, right? So technical knowledge and expertise and using them in these kind of what I would say, and many others would refer to as kind of these public regarding ways. So that's where I'm coming from. But before we jump into kind of the challenges that we face. I want to talk about terminology, because it's one of the things I kind of confront and have to deal with is I'm affiliated with a place called the National Institute for Civil Discourse. Things like civility are very popular and very frequently referred to in lots of spaces. So I apologize, this is exactly what you're not supposed to put on a slide, is a lot of words, but here we are, because it kind of gets to the point. Civility often can mean this, what's described here at the beginning. Civility is about politeness, right? It's about putting your pinky up when you're drinking a cup of tea, kind of following the rules. Do you have these kind of expectations in classrooms, environments where you show up, right? That sense of how you're supposed to act, how you might want to be, these types of scenarios. Totally appropriate, right? But it has its limitations, and we can begin to see a lot of challenges to this. Well, we might want to think a little bit more robustly about something like civility as it's referred to here, of this idea of responsiveness, right? What is our relationship to one another? This sense of expectation. And frankly, this is challenging because as this bottom point says, right, if we can think about the slogan for civility as politeness being that we can disagree without being disagreeable. You've probably heard these kinds of things, or we can just agree to disagree. these kinds of scenarios, we might more appropriately want to say, this is about disagreement that is no reason to stop talking with one another. And this is really where I want to spend our time tonight, of thinking, if you hear the word civil discourse or civility, being really rooted in this idea that we have some expectation or commitment to each other, even when we have some deep disagreement and tensions that might really be challenging, offer kind of these confrontations. How do we overcome that and kind of stay in relationship? Oh, it got cut off. I also want to highlight here that there are a lot of words that I'm going to use tonight that might be helpful to frame. A lot of this comes around what we talk about as dialogue and deliberation. And the root of this, the word for deliberation, you can see it at the very bottom here, is literally the same thing when we have the word for weight, right, for pounds. It really comes from this same sense of how do we weigh tensions and trade-offs, which is a practice that's really easy to kind of forego and kind of pass because it requires us to step into a space where we're maybe not as confident or as sure as we might be, or as we think we ought to be. And so when I'm talking tonight, I want us to have this orientation to really thinking about this idea of dialogue and deliberation almost as being kind of complementary and kind of interwoven with one another, that communication has this essential and vital role to play, but we also need to create the environments for that to happen, okay? Good? Yep, all right, I'm seeing heads nod, this is good, thanks. All right, so I want. Here are a lot of challenges. So I've got kind of 4 big things I want to talk about tonight. And I'm interested, especially when we get towards the end, I want you to push back a little bit, or if you've got questions about this. This is just kind of from my research, from my experience as an educator in lots of ways. In fact, tonight, if I weren't here, I would be in the Kansas Capitol because I'm working with our legislators on how do they function as a body, truly as a deliberative body. And so in January, we had a crazy ice storm, but we had 80 legislators across the parties in both houses convene for a workshop that has spurred this kind of ongoing conversation. So they've committed to every 2 weeks get together and we work and talk about some of these types of issues. So I'm here with you instead of in Topeka, Kansas. It's actually very nice here, by the way. Your weather is wonderful. I always forget that until I'm here in like February and I'm reminded of why it's such a great place to be. But we have lots of challenges, all sorts of places. But I want to talk about these. These are the 4. So I'm going to kind of unpack each of these. The first one's a little bit longer than the others. This same slide will show up a few times, so you'll see it. All right? So our challenges. We have this lack of civil discourse, due in large part to kind of this polarization and separation that we experience. I'm going to show a little image here. It's going to move in a second. You may have seen this. There's a great graphic that has been used that tracks basically Congress from the mid-20th century to just a few years ago, looking at issues of polarization. So I'm going to talk over this for a moment so you can see while it goes on here too. But what's going to highlight between these colors is you can see the sense of connections. So the bigger dots have more connections than the smaller ones. And so this is 1949 to 51. Watch how it goes. So this is every couple years, every 2 years with the new Congress. Tell me if you're seeing any patterns in a moment. I think there's one more. So what happened? What did you see? Literally, you can yell it out. This is not like some rhetorical question. This is like a legitimate question. What did you see? Got to say it loud. Yeah.
They went from being unified to...
Okay, so they went, as you said, from being unified to something completely separate. And somebody else? I saw another hand somewhere. There's got to be another hand somewhere. Anybody else? Do we buy that? Do we think that's right? Yeah? I'm seeing a little head shake. You know, what do you say? Yeah, sure. You. Yeah, you. You said who? What did you say?
You see tribalism. You see them stop trying to work together.
Okay, so as he said, you see tribalism. People stop trying to work together, right? Perceivably? Yeah. So I think these are kind of speaking to some of these realities. And there's all sorts of things. I'm not going to try to unpack this tonight. but this is part of kind of the climate environment that we exist in. You can see over the course of time, it's really hard because it's relatively small, but you can see where you had conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans, all sorts of kind of variation, and we had places of overlap, kind of crossing. What we have largely come to experience, and for many of you, especially if you were born any time from the early to mid-90s on, is that the only way that you have experienced kind of political life, I don't know if this will shine here, right, is really rooted in this deep sense of kind of partisanship. That is kind of you could say a new normal, but the expectation is that we're not going to interact and engage with one another. So there's a striking piece here, right? And you might experience this, right? Has anybody had this kind of feeling of being in a place, whether it's in a classroom, it's in kind of a social space with friends or otherwise, where you maybe very clearly or maybe very subtly experience that sense of being that other, right? So that one kind of outlier, especially in political conversations. A piece that does get shared across, especially generations, is captured by this American Psychological Association survey from 2017. So this says, no matter people's age, more than half, and you can see these percentages, believe that this is the lowest point in our history that they can remember. And these are folks who have lived through World War II, Vietnam, Gulf War, Oklahoma City bombings, September 11th, these kind of the existence of high-profile shootings. People are saying this is the lowest point that they can remember across all the way from millennials, and I realize that it could be even younger at this point, but speaking all the way from older adults, baby boomers, Gen X, and millennials, that this is kind of a challenge. This is not the first time. Anybody seen this before, this image? It's very famous. It's actually got connections to South Carolina. This is from 1856 during the Bleeding Kansas crisis, so it felt like appropriate for me to include here. This is one of South Carolina's members of Congress actually attacking, Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina attacked Senator Charles Schumer, or Sumner from Massachusetts on the floor of Congress over the issue of slavery. Sumner was an abolitionist, and so he had just given this talk, and it kind of erupted as this really kind of violent act. And I point to this because sometimes, especially following this slide, right, we have had really deep division and challenges and experiences in our past. So it's not to dismiss that. What it is to say, this poll, is to highlight that people have this sense that this is the lowest point, right? So this is a real challenge that we're kind of confronted with. And we find that. And survey after survey, this is from 2018, that 93% of people say this idea of civility is a problem across parties, right? So mid-90s, we see this showing up in lots of ways. Has anybody read this book or heard about this maybe from faculty or others, but Bowling Alone? Putnam, yeah, all right. Yeah, what's the gist? You wanna say it? What's the story? Yeah, you can say it, yeah. So people are increasingly isolated and have kind of lost these connections. You want to add, so where does this title come from?
Well, it comes from, I think, in Michigan or whatever.
Yeah.
Where communities got together and had bowling lanes, et cetera, and were actually participating well.
Yeah, so literally Bowling Alone, it starts originally as an article, becomes this book, very, very popular. You have to almost reference it if you have anything related to this kind of stuff, is that people aren't joining those bowling leagues, which were these kind of spaces where people who got out kind of their family life and interacted with people from a workplace or kind of their community. So let me ask a quick question. This is literally a participation moment. How many of you have ever bowled in your life? Raise your hand. How many of you have ever bowled a bowling ball? You've never bowled? You should raise your hand. Okay. No, that's fine. Okay, lots of hands. How many of you are in a bowling league? Hang on, I can't. Anybody? No? Why not? Why are you not in the bowling league? They didn't stop? You can get those awesome shirts anymore, right? Yeah, right. You may like the shirts and the shoes, right? And maybe a sense is, and I'm joking, right? But that they've stopped. In fact, they continue in some ways, but not in the same regard, especially when you think about the mid-20th century or a little bit later. that is alluded to in this research. And I pair this with a couple other books that are helpful. If this is kind of an interesting question, the sense of kind of social interaction and connection between people, the two books in the center and to the right actually offer a little bit more of a kind of a liberal and a conservative kind of viewpoint on this question of what does it mean when we lose those social connections and interactions. So the Dunkelman book really highlights, and it uses this wonderful opening to the book of, he grew up in Buffalo, New York, and had moved places, and he refers to Cincinnati, Ohio, close to where I grew up actually. And he says, I can still name all of the neighbors that I had as a kid. You know, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so. But I can't tell you the people who live behind me now. And it'd be interesting, right? We don't have to kind of respond to this, but think about that question, right? Who do we know in our lives? And so if you're living here, if you're a student here on campus, or if you're living off campus, can you tell me the people who live 3 doors down from you? Not the band, right? And maybe yes, or depending on the complex, or in these kinds of scenarios. But part of this is really wrapped in this sense of who do we know and how do we know them. And Carney's book really speaks about this from a more kind of conservative, particularly rural context. So these are both really fascinating books. But his argument really is grounded in these small communities that have found ways to kind of thrive when we've seen a lot of this kind of loss, especially in rural places, is the strong sense of social identity and kind of cohesion even across some of these lines of difference. So I'm going to throw a couple books here to you just as a possible reference and a way to make some sense of it. But this is all wrapped up in what David Matthews, the president of the Kettering Foundation, not the singer, but he says this is about the ecology of democracy. Another way to visualize this is a little easier of thinking about all the institutions in a community that can play these kinds of roles of kind of fostering democratic practices. Schools and universities, churches, faith communities, mosques, the arts, the role of government, business. All of these pieces are kind of interwoven as part of this fabric of communities. And this is frankly challenged in a lot of respects. And so when we think about the ways that we choose to or actually have the opportunity to interact, it leads to some of the responses that show up on some of these kinds of surveys. So this is the 2019 Weber-Chandrick survey, that image I just showed you a moment ago of 93% of folks saying civility is a problem. This is for the last decade. They skipped 2015. I don't know why. I don't know if they were just too busy or what happened. It's weird. But basically for the last decade, you can see kind of the steady nature of these questions. So people who say civility or civil discourse is a minor or a major problem, right, very consistent and very high. So basically, you can do your quick math. Overwhelmingly, almost all people. And so what does this look like, right? What are the consequences? We have lots of situations and instances where this is playing out, whether it's online, face-to-face, in communities. Have you ever experienced? I'm going to go through a couple slides here just so you can see some of these graphics. Right, the number of instances of this occurring. Have you, any of you, and again, we don't have to talk about it and don't feel compelled to kind of raise a hand here, but have you ever experienced these kinds of interactions of kind of incivility, whether it's in a classroom or it's in a community? Anybody? Yeah? Yeah? I appreciate honesty. Right? Maybe? Yeah? Okay. So we're seeing some of these factors, and I want to just note here that there are some differences, especially when you think about identification of party, and also some similarities, right? So I'll just take a moment here of the 3 factors kind of contributing to this, particularly from this Weber-Chandrick survey. Right, so social media plays a huge role. After that, it gets a little different. The things that we want to avoid talking about. Anybody surprised? No? Oh, everybody laughs now, right? Anybody surprised? No? Is this kind of on par with what you're thinking, what you've expected, or kind of assumed might be? Yeah? Okay. So this brings me to this amazingly bad graphic, but it's what we got. There's this guy named Jürgen Habermas. Anybody read Habermas? Yeah, I like you. Yeah, this is good. Your connection to the Bowling Alone and Habermas here. Habermas, he's still around. He's this phenomenal thinker from what's called the Frankfurt School. but he's a philosopher, and he kind of helped craft this language, what we refer to as the public sphere. And so when we think about your own life here for a moment, we all exist in our own spaces and the ways we interact or don't. And he kind of gives language that we have our private lives. I'll stay over here so it looks this way, right? We have our private lives, and then we have kind of the role of government and law, right? The things that kind of get formed by these kind of decision processes. And in the middle, right, if you were to draw a Venn diagram, is this idea of the public sphere. And ideally, that's supposed to be a place where we're interacting, where we're learning from one another, we're being informed, all of this kind of stuff. One of the really big challenges that we face is that it's very difficult, this is referencing back to some of that, the bowling alone idea and the other kind of titles, is that we don't have a lot of opportunities for a variety of reasons, right? That we are really somewhat, kind of about right here, we don't have the opportunity to step in these kind of discursive ways that we might expect into this kind of shared sense of life, that we are being shaped and influenced by particular streams of information, whether we know it or not. Increasingly, we are aware of that. I remember a number of years ago, you could go into Facebook. I realize Facebook is now not the cool thing to do anymore, but I'll use this still as my reference. You could figure out, if you didn't self-identify, which a lot of people did politically, it could figure out who you were based off the things that you liked and shared and all of this. We are kind of swimming in a world of information that is, frankly, amazingly beneficial in many ways because it's determined for us. A great challenge is that we only see these images, read these stories that are kind of reinforcing of these narratives and worldviews that we have. And one of the big challenges, this just came out a couple of days ago from a colleague of mine who kind of studies social media and its implications on democracy, is that we have kind of in the current state of politics these environments that are shaping and influencing how we interact or don't interact with either information or with one another that we don't even realize. So that brings us to our second piece. Institutions. That's not a really fun way to kind of think about some of this, that we don't have a lot of trust in these. So going back to some of the work of Putnam and others, is that we're not practicing a lot of this. So this is a few years ago. Trust in the institutions. You can see, this is from 1995 to 15. You can see some of these going, well, let me ask you this question. Which way are they going, mostly? Up or down? Down. Okay, good, right? So we can see this. Congress is always very low. Police, military are rather high, but our average is actually quite low considering. And even something like higher education, we see increasingly now kind of these partisan divides about a sense of what is the purpose of these institutions, what are they doing? And part of this is kind of reinforced by I think, frankly, unfairly, some of the narratives about what happens in universities. And part of what I'll talk about in a few minutes is kind of the prospect of how do we create these spaces where we can have more kind of constructive either learning experiences or otherwise that might kind of flip a little bit of this. And this leads us to this sense of narratives. I think, yeah, the next one is a great shot, so get ready. Right? The danger of a single story is that, can you see it very well, right? Depending on where you're looking and how you're looking at something, how you're taking that information in, is going to influence your not just perception, but also kind of lived reality around that issue. And so when we think about these questions of the role of education and what we're doing to kind of create the environment, the opportunities for interaction, we can be, I mean, back to that last few slides about kind of the role of media, social media, is that they are kind of reinforcing some of these narratives that determine and shape how we see the world with, I think, really detrimental effect. And then lastly, this kind of divisive rhetoric and the practices in response to shifting in demographics. We are in this interesting moment of transition, and we have been, and I think the United States is frankly wrestling with some of these types of questions of what does it mean to be the United States? What does it mean to be American? And as we are seeing in public policy decisions, and not just in the immediate past, but for quite a while, right, a real wrestling with these ideas. And as a site, as a campus that hosts many political candidates and conversations, you may know full well, right, of the importance of these narratives that people have about what is and what ought to be, what could be, and for us to kind of be able to respond to this. So what's the role of education, of the university? So I want to talk a little bit about what this place can do. Not just Winthrop, but higher education more generally. And by answering that question, it's going to refer us to an earlier time. So I want to point to some practices that happened about 100 years ago, and a little bit after that, about 80 years ago. But the first is from John Dewey. Anybody heard that name before, John Dewey? Anybody in education? Yeah, okay, I'm seeing a yes here, maybe a few others. John Dewey was this amazing philosopher of education, but he kind of got co-opted by just about everybody in various disciplines. But he had this very famous book called The Public and Its Problems. And he has these two lines that I think are really important for our thinking, right? Democracy must begin at home, and its home is the neighborly community. Think back to those studies I was highlighting of that sense of loss of interaction. What happens when we don't have that sense of not just neighborhood, but of this really vibrant sense of community? And then also, right, if we want to kind of retrieve this life, unless local communal life can be restored, the public cannot adequately resolve its most urgent problem, to find and identify itself, right? So we're really at this loss of becoming, even seeing ourselves as part of something larger, and then becoming that. And then a third line from Dewey that I think is really important for us is that democracy has to be born anew every generation, and education is its midwife. Democracy is not just a thing that happens. This is where I think a lot of the political discussion in recent years has highlighted that it's something that is lived and potentially maybe fragile if we don't kind of maintain these norms and expectations from one another. So I want to just spend a couple minutes looking at a historical example of some of this, and in fact, some of this was going on here in South Carolina. So this is from the New Deal. The 1930s were a very challenging time. There was a great story in the New Yorker just recently called "The Last Time Democracy Almost Died," and it highlighted some of this work from this period. I've spent quite a bit looking at this era. There's this amazing juxtaposition here, right? This billboard, there's no way like the American way, with those who are literally in a bread line waiting to get some food. And so during this time, there were efforts across this country. This is a story from the New York Times in 1935, referring to the beacon lights of democracy, where a group discussion, people across kind of lines of difference in their communities, different backgrounds and experiences, showed up in gymnasiums and high schools, in kind of Grange halls and other places in their own communities to have informed conversation. They had these kinds of flyers that looked like this, right? So we're talking about the future of democracy as not just this hypothetical, but in a very significant way, a very real question. And alongside, so a lot of this was happening in cities, was also happening in rural communities. Some of these images you may have seen before, particularly maybe this one on the left. So places across the country were really challenged. But in the 1930s, the government, with the universities particularly, the land-grant universities, like Clemson here in South Carolina, helped facilitate conversations that would meet in people's front rooms and these halls and talk about all sorts of questions. Things like, what's the future of our soil? So when we think about environmental issues or impacts today, this is one of those scenarios that we might learn from. Importantly, these were resource documents. Remember when I had that slide up about discussion and deliberation as something to refer to? This is coming back to those questions of how do we have these conversations? And it was framed fundamentally around questions. A lot of background information, but it didn't tell you what to think. So they would talk about a whole host of issues, things that for us are highly relevant today. They would talk about, this may not sound super exciting to you, but things like taxes and imports. the tensions between urban and rural communities. But these were practices that were going on across this country. This is another discussion guide. You can't see it very well on this particular screen, but around this table, it speaks to the diversity of the types of people who would show up in these conversations, right? So people who were sympathetic to the role of the government intervening on farmers, people who were deeply opposed to it. Importantly, the woman who owns her own farm and other things like that. And so really thinking about some of the diversity of the time. And so when we think about civil discourse, it really is rooted in this idea that we have, importantly, the expectation of interacting with one another. It's not necessarily easy or something that we're inclined to do, or maybe even feel comfortable doing, but it becomes an essential skill. And so they would train community leaders, people who had some interest in this idea, to be able to facilitate these conversations. And it got very practical, if you can see this, right? Learn people's names, right? Have resources. They talk about blackboards, so the same ways that we would have things pertinent to our ability to actually interact. Even to the extent of let's talk in a dynamic way rather than literally just kind of going around a room. And so I include this, you can't see this, I'm going to pull up a quote here. This, I found this last night. So this is from 1937, 83 years ago, and this is from here in South Carolina, about a young person who had just graduated from then Clemson College, who was learning how to facilitate conversations. And I pulled this from a much longer text, literally that kind of captured the spirit of the life of what was going on in these conversations. And so this was literally in February of 17, or 37. And it had apparently been raining for days and days, so there were all these stories about how muddy the roads were and all sorts of things. But the middle piece is what I want to kind of highlight here, right? They got around, so talking about the circular informality of how they chose to interact in Seton. And so the person who was leading, this young chap, right, Clemson College, and fundamentally they were interested in this future of young people, right? Then they also talked about the importance of having apples and bananas, right? So it was why we have kind of snacks and things at receptions. But this idea of practicing and learning democracy was deeply rooted in a variety of communities in cities, large and small, as well as in really rural communities that were really confronting kind of a change and challenge of who they were, what it looked like to kind of transition, maybe not all that dissimilar to our own. So what can we do? The university has a really important role to play here. There famously is this scholarship from the mid-90s from someone named Ernest Boyer who talked about the scholarship of engagement. And I would encourage us all to be thinking about some of these questions, regardless of who you are, right? That the university, as he says here, the academy, must become a vigorous partner in the search for answers of our most pressing social, civic, economic, and moral problems, and must reaffirm its historic commitment to what I call the scholarship of engagement. Some of those things that I was just highlighting, I think, embody some of these practices. It's not just about partnerships or placements, but it's really about this deep sense of relationship, of the university playing a vital role, and all of its parts, right? So it's not just professors, it's not just staff who have these responsibilities or expectations, but it's for students and others to really help kind of embody this idea. One of the challenges is that we often think about this kind of work in maybe disconnected ways. And so I highlighted here for a moment that when we think about community engagement, anybody do kind of volunteering, service, learning work? Have you had some of these kinds of things in classes? Yeah, okay. It's increasingly kind of showing up. One of the challenges is that conversation often exists over here, and this idea of civil discourse, dialogue, and deliberation is somewhere over here, somehow disconnected. A colleague at Colorado State kind of shared this language around this, right? That there's this unfortunate kind of disconnect between these worlds. He says, are these that far apart? And I would say no, which is why there are a number of efforts that are really grounded in this sense of how do we teach politics, not in that kind of formal way of representatives and knowing the number of people in Congress, those types of things, but that are really practiced as ideas embodied by people. And so deliberative pedagogy is a really fancy way of saying, how do we think of these democratic practices being rooted in how we learn, right? Grounded in these ideas of referencing Boyer, this idea of engaged scholarship. So right? It's democratic education in a really kind of fundamental way. Was I too quick? Were you getting a shot? Do you want it? No. Do you want it? You better take it now because I went back. You got it? Okay, good. But it's really about how do we kind of create this from developing skills, behaviors, these kinds of practices. And importantly, right, I want to highlight here, it's really about how do we create space. And think about this for yourselves. How do you respond to those earlier questions? How do we create and hold space for authentic, productive dialogue? Conversations that can ultimately not only be educational, but also transformative. What is it that moves us from just having that kind of transactional information that might be good to know, especially if you've got a test or some assignment, but also moving it beyond that to say, these are kind of fundamental practices for me as a citizen, as a member of this community, and also the communities that I'm going to be a part of in the future. Right, so this idea of cultivating kind of thoughtful citizens through these practices can lead us to some of these ideas, right? How do we have opportunities and space for kind of the idea of divergent thinking and the ability to converge? I have it here in a moment, right? Anybody ever heard this language before? The groan zone, right? It literally comes from this place of when we're beginning a process, we might have kind of the business of usual, how we choose to interact, what we know, and before we have the ability to have that range of divergent ideas and coming to a point of resolution is literally this idea of saying, ugh. That's why it's called the groan zone. It's literally the sense of just frustration from the experience. And when we think about these kind of practices in classrooms and beyond and this is literally coming from the Deliberative Pedagogy book, of thinking about where does this align with these ideas of deliberation. And so when we look at some of this, right, this idea of divergence and convergence, you can see where it starts to become really important for us at the individual level, and also for a kind of a community, whether that's in a classroom or beyond. The sense of how do we create opportunities for people to speak and interact, as well as this broader sense of kind of this culture and environment. The importance of something like listening, for example. We're very accustomed, especially when there's an expectation of you saying something, of people kind of talking about stuff, and you're just getting queued up and you're ready to go, right? So if I ask you a question, if I were your professor tonight, right, and kind of posed a question, you might be getting ready to have some response. The challenge is you're not listening to the 5 people who are before you because you're getting ready for the thing that you want to say. All the research points to the moments that we listen and then actually respond is in the milliseconds. It's virtually non-existent. Most of us don't have these kinds of practices. And so when we think about kind of how do we have divergent thinking, how do we work through these challenges and then come to a place of convergence, is really rooted in this idea of discourse with one another. Another way to look at this, and I'm going to make this smaller so you can actually see it, is really rooted in what do we learn, right? So I would be interested, especially for students, and I'm not making an assumption that you've gone through like kind of this from a structured way or even what year you're in, but we could think about this, and some institutions have really embraced this idea of how do we move from kind of the introduction ideas to this place to where you are kind of really grounded, as the language shows up here, this sense of capstone, right? This deep sense of knowledge about issues like this. And so my question is, are these important, right? The ability for us to have collaboration, for us to be able to have kind of reason giving, right? For us to be able to justify why we see the world and experience it the ways that we do. What about something like the ability to synthesize ideas? Understanding the trade-offs and tensions of an issue, reflection, that sense of relationship and empathy. These are kind of core democratic practices and ideas that not just show up in classrooms, but also just in ordinary life. And that is way too small, so I'm not even going to say it. But it's this sense of how do we kind of shape this new terrain? And it has implications for faculty, for the way that professors choose to structure and teach courses, and the way that students show up. So I'll just say briefly while we look at a screen that you can't read, is one of the things that I've adopted, I've done this a number of times with students, both undergraduate and graduate, is that I have them help determine how we do the syllabus. And by that, I have a range of assignments, and then they have the little box. I don't know if when you got your syllabi this semester, they say, the test is 25%, the final paper is 15%. You know what I'm talking about? I leave those blank. we talk about it. And I have them work through it. And sometimes I've had students really spend a few weeks figuring out what was the process that we wanted to take to actually understand those issues. So what could be a drawback to that? If I were to say, let's do that tonight, because I've done this in real time with students, the first night of the class we figured it out. What would be a drawback to that? If I was like, hey, you're a student, what's your name? Unity. All right, Unity, you're in my class, fictitious class. And we're going to do this. We're going to have 4 assignments, and we're going to figure it out tonight. What's a potential drawback to that? Okay, right, so maybe a question about how do we want to think about the percentages. What's another factor? If all of a sudden, we just met each other, right? What do you know? Or the flip of that, what don't you know, right? You don't know how I'm going to teach or how I'm going to grade, right? So there might be all sorts of questions about, well, what can or should we do? So this highlights, for me, one of these really practical ways of, we often are confronted with challenges of, having information, of how do we want to actually go about doing this. Some gives a lot of anxiety. I had graduate students once, we had a 3-hour class, and one student was just like, it was like my first semester, and he said, I don't know what to do here. I've never had you, nobody's ever had you, we don't know how you grade, all these kinds of things. And it was this moment of great challenge because he was being expected to decide on something that had a real meaning in his life, right, a grade in a class, and he was confronted by these questions of ambiguity. And when we think about, this is one example, so this is not the only thing, and it's actually maybe not even the best for some of these ideas, but it speaks to the sense of how do we democratize some of these spaces. And so it highlights what comes up in the most recent project that I've been a part of how do we democratize opportunities in education? How do we think about this showing up in classrooms, literally the ways that we might choose to teach, that we interact? How do we flatten some of that, as well as the ways that we think about residence halls? So from this most recent project, we have some work from colleagues at Denison University in Ohio, who have totally revamped. Anybody an RA? I don't know. Is that your language here? RAs? Okay. Anybody an RA? No RAs? Okay. We can talk about them. They have totally revamped their sense of what that means. Anybody live in a residence hall? Let me ask you that question. Okay. Okay. You live places. Good. So they have totally revamped the ways that they do this. Instead of some kind of judicial system where you've done something that's wrong and they try to intervene or address it, they have created environments where they have these kind of constructive conversations about it and where they have kind of rethought that sense of expectation of what it means to be, say, even a resident of a hall. So it's not just like, here's the list of rules that you need to abide by, but how do we really think of us owning and having some sense of expectation? So back to Unity for our class, right? That sense of, if you're all of a sudden helping to decide what the percentage of a grade in a class is, you might have a greater sense of expectation of like, well, we did say we were going to do this, instead of just Dr. Shaffer being like, that's 25%, those kinds of things, right? Oh, see you later. I guess we're done. The sense of us being able to have some sense of ownership, though, is really important. And I want to just highlight here, and we'll bring this really to a place of some questions and conversation in a moment. We're confronting, this is a real image. This is from my own campus. We have really an opportunity to put some of these in practice, is that there are big questions on our campus about a student organization that is arguably, from those who are in support, say, it's in support and aligning with kind of conservative ideology and positions. Those who are opposed to it are really saying that it's rooted in a sense of racism and xenophobia and these kinds of issues. Just last week, we were beginning, a number of us, to have interactions around how do we have conversations about this, rather than just having it fall into this kind of familiar practice of here's a group of people who believe something, and here's a group of people who are opposed to it, and let's see who can kind of yell at the other group the loudest and really be kind of confronted by that. And so for us, this is not just about how do we kind of show up in the ways that we construct a class or how we teach, or for you as a student, how do you kind of show up for learning, but really thinking about these tensions of free speech. This is from a colleague at Tufts University. Free speech and the sense of inclusion, right? This expectation of community, who that is, what that means, and how do we kind of wrestle with these really fundamental, deep questions, especially for a place that is about open ideas and exchange. And so when we think about this also beyond our campuses, we are importantly going to be thinking about similar questions. And so our Institute for Civic Discourse and Democracy uses very fundamentally, and this is a very kind of similar experience to a lot of other institutions, right? Some sense of expectation of how do we want to talk about this? And you might notice some very basic things here, right? How do we seek understanding from one another? How do we expect fundamentally that we're going to have some levels of disagreement? Conflict is not necessarily bad. Confrontation is not productive. What happens when you have some conflict? I won't pick on you anymore. When we have a conflict about something, what's a benefit? I won't just pick on you, maybe everybody over here. If we have some conflict about an issue, what's a benefit to that? Yeah, we get other opinions, other viewpoints, experiences. Yeah, you're getting a thumbs up back here behind you, right? This sense of expectation that we're not all going to be on the same page. Why is that important to acknowledge, right? It's that, especially if we live in kind of a pluralistic, democratic society, like that's a good thing. We need to find instead, rather than kind of shutting that down, we need to find instead ways for us to actually have those kind of opportunities. And so this then highlights some of these other points, right? How do we give people opportunities to speak? Literally, what kind of processes can allow us to do some of this? When we listen to one another, what do we potentially learn, right? So it's not just about getting queued up to say something, but it's about being open and willing to possibly reconsider a viewpoint. Not necessarily that you're going to walk, and what's your name? Amber? It's not so much that Amber's going to walk in the room and say, I see the world in this way, and then an hour later you're going to walk out and say, you know what, that whole thing is totally abandoned, right? I'm shifting from that place. More realistically, and frankly why it's really important, is that we have some degree of openness, that we're going to listen, we're going to be able to offer and support claims, and that we might be influenced, maybe even changed, right? A really powerful moment, if I could just share this for a moment, is a few semesters ago we had a new law in the state of Kansas where we had concealed handguns on our college campuses, all the public institutions. Caused a lot of conversation, interaction, and so I had students facilitating conversations about this. And there was one student who, it wouldn't be like any of you, but he sat in the back, he always had his hat backwards and all this, he was kind of too cool for school then, and he was strongly opposed to this. And we spent a whole semester talking about the issue. He helped facilitate conversations, we did all sorts of things. At the very end of the semester, we were reflecting on the experience, and I said, you know, and it's fine for us not to all be in agreement because somebody else had just spoken who, at the beginning, they were kind of these other ends of the spectrum. And I said, and I look at him, I was like, you know, and you don't have to necessarily change your view on this, you can just think about it as a more complex issue. And before I could kind of finish that, he said, well, actually, I thought about this a lot. And he's like, and I spend a lot of time at the rec, the gym, right? He's like, and I realized, gosh, it's pretty stupid to have guns in the gym where everybody's getting really worked up and we're having, we just won or lost. And it was one of those kind of simple, but for me, one of those really significant moments where he had an opportunity. We literally had 15, 16 weeks to talk about this topic and the ways that we should talk about it. And he was moved by that, not so much to totally abandon what he viewed or held, but to really have this kind of more nuanced take on it. And the second piece from that semester was I worked with graduate students. And we had a number of people who were really strongly in opposition to this idea. And there was one student who was adamant. He said, we shouldn't be doing this. We really need these guns. And he said, we need to have law-abiding kind of expectations, all these things. And I don't want to be emotional about it, but after the semester he wrote a note. And he said, thank you for the semester. And I appreciate you not kind of giving your view, because they could actually never figure out what I thought about the topic. And he's like, thank you for never advocating for a certain position. And he said, the reason why I was so kind of passionate about the idea, he said, my brother was a school shooter. So decades prior, he had apparently gotten their father's a shotgun, and he took it to school. And the kid that he was apparently going to shoot wasn't there. He was homesick. And the principal tried to intervene, and he shot him and killed him. And when I think about that, it highlights, I think, the importance of, if I would have advocated, and this is for everyone, but especially the students, right? If you have that experience in a class of someone just saying, you ought to really think about it this way, the sense of viewpoint diversity and having that opportunity, highlighting some of this sense of kind of that openness, that breadth is really important. Because I didn't know he was sitting there. And we spent 15 weeks together really wrestling with these questions and how to do it. And at the end he said, thank you for having us think about this, because as he said in the closing of that note to me, I feel so strongly about this because if I would have been in that school and I had a gun, I would have shot him. It's like a gut punch. It's real and significant. And so when we're talking about these ideas of kind of democratizing learning, and which is a fancy way of saying how do we practice kind of democracy in everyday life, it becomes potentially very real very fast. Which leads us, and I'm not going to go deeply into this, tomorrow with a number of faculty we're going to really kind of explore these ideas of how do we think about these different models, these different approaches. So depending on what we're trying to do, we're really going to have different kinds of conversations. Sometimes we really want to just be exploring questions. If there's been an incident on campus, how do we have the beginning of an interaction, a conversation about that? How do we also appropriately think about a potential issue of conflict that we want to be able to kind of transform in some ways? And so there are particular processes that can be really hopeful. So if you've done something like a World Cafe, for example, for exploration, is amazing. It doesn't require lots of expectations or roles of facilitators to do it. It can be very easy with some big pieces of paper where you can write and draw and do all sorts of things. It's cut off if the screen went down to about here. It would say you can get more information at ncdd.org. If you look for this phrase, kind of streams of practice at NCDD, you can find all of this stuff, and I'd be happy to share it in whatever way is appropriate. But when we think about decision-making or collaborative action, right, this whole breadth of these interactions becomes really important for us. Because we don't want to have the same kind of interaction, right? The thing that I was doing in that class when we was doing the syllabus or some of these other moments, we're going to appropriately want to think about the right approach for us to be exploring those questions. And it leads us to, I think, one of the most fundamental things that the university can and should do. Think back to those old images from the 1930s, right? That sense of using the front halls, the universities, the gymnasiums of high schools. How do we think about those social interactions and connections? And arguably, universities need to be these kinds of hubs. So this is some way to think about networks of some sort. What are those connections between and among people? And increasingly we see this. I am part of one of these kinds of universities that has embraced some of this language and idea. I've kind of nosed around a little bit, so we could talk more about some of this tomorrow, but some of these ideas and work, it's happening at a number of universities in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's in classes, sometimes it's in student life, sometimes it's in both, right? Libraries play an essential role in a lot of this, student organizations. So when we think about the roles of universities, there are literally thousands of them in all sorts of communities. And one of the efforts that's really something I'm committed to is this idea of how do we put these practices into play in these places, from community colleges to public institutions, four-year, to the research-intensive places, to the liberal arts colleges. You can kind of think about the spectrum here and what role these universities play as these civic hubs for democracy in their own communities. And so it brings us back to this question. And this is where I'd like to end, I think. What is the purpose of education? Right? What did you put down there at the beginning? This is a rhetorical one until we talk in a few minutes. And then how do you create space for this? Here at the university, but also beyond. The ways that you choose to answer those questions has a huge impact on this sense of civic discourse and interaction. Because, and this is where I'll tease out here a little bit, so I did lie, this isn't totally the last one. Right? This work is happening across the country in lots of ways. There are a number of organizations and institutions. I mentioned the National Institute for Civil Discourse is one among many other partners. You can think about this at all different scales. This is a colleague of mine sitting right here. During the day, one of the during the day, one of the impeachment hearings were going on in another room. This was happening. A group of bipartisan representatives called the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, how's that for a title, is really working to say, how do we work together? Because they recognize Congress is kind of a mess, right? And when we look at politics in that sense, it's a real challenge. But also when we look at it locally, whether we look at it in our own institutions, in our communities, it's really easy to dismiss a lot of this and say, this is not something I want to be a part of. And part of this is to say, this is work we need to be doing. And so NICD has a number of resources. One of them is highlighted here, this idea of engaging differences. So this kind of curriculum of sorts, some videos and some questions, it's still being kind of just recently launched, but there are a host of these efforts that are happening. I referenced ncdd.org earlier, nicd.org, or nicd.arizona.edu is where you can get a lot of this work too. There are a lot of efforts that are happening. This is, importantly, a moment similar to the 1930s, right? Globally, we're seeing these transitions away from democracy. How do we reclaim that? And I think fundamentally, a lot of that work falls not on just you, or just on me, but on all of us. Thank you very much. So I just talked to you for a long time. So we got some time for Q's and A's. I think the practice is yell a question, and I'm going to repeat it so everybody can hear it because I have a mic, and then we'll talk about it that way, which is slightly awkward, but that's what we got. So thoughts, reactions, things you want to poke on here? Do you buy it? Do you not? Well, let me see it here. I want to ask you, what's the role of education? What's the purpose of education? What'd you say? And did it change from the beginning to the end at all? Or have you reconsidered or thought about it? So what's the role of education? Anybody want to say publicly? No? Opportunity? Okay. Anybody else? Yeah.
Enlightenment of ideas.
Ooh, enlightenment of ideas. Very good. Yeah. Getting a job. Anybody say getting a job? Yeah. Of course you did. Yeah. Why didn't you say it before?
Well, mostly I don't know.
Okay. That's fair. That's fair. It's hard to talk out in front of lots of folks. But right, there's a whole bunch of reasons we show up here and we see this. And part of education is to kind of wrestle with these bigger questions too. So you want to have a job, and also you want to be a thoughtful citizen. So what other questions, thoughts people have? I can do it like class. I'll just stand and wait. Yeah.
I guess my question would be, you pointed out that there is this disparity in civil discourse, but what do you think, your opinion, is the reason why? Why have we become so polarized?
So it's been, great question. So why have we become so polarized? I kind of shrunk that down. What else? Is that good enough? Okay. So there are multiple layers that come into play here. One is, back to that public sphere thing when I was talking about that with Habermas, the sense of the role of media having a huge role to play. And so the ways that we get information, how we choose to access it or not. But increasingly for us, right, we have the opportunity to have that kind of self-selected, and then this is like that narrative image, right? That self-selected channel that we might want to receive information from, right? So it's this kind of enclave mentality, right? That we have a filter, a bubble, whatever language we might want to use that reinforces that. And so it's really easy to stay within those environments. Part of, back to some of the Putnam work, very, very famously there was a book by Bill Bishop who kind of highlighted, it was called The Big Sort. And and he basically tracked people's kind of shifts in population of where they live. And so sometimes, I didn't do it tonight, but for a moment here, think about the question of where did you grow up, right? So think about I close my eyes because I always ask people to close their eyes. Think about where you lived, where you grew up. It could be that or where you are now. Do people look like you? Do people have the same socioeconomic status? Do they have the same religious traditions? These kinds of questions. And for a lot of folks, it's often yes. And part of that is because we find similarities that we want to have. Or we've been marginalized by a system and we're kind of left, right? Whatever it might be. And so it's not always about that ease of mobility, but sometimes it's because others have left, right? So when we think about something like white flight, for example, is a classic example of that kind of disparity. But it reinforces, right? So when we show up at certain places, faith communities, or if we always go to the same coffee shop, the people who are part of those communities are very often able to kind of reinforce, we refer to them as kind of third spaces, right? Aside from kind of home and work, where do you go? And if you have a lot of opportunity to choose some of that, that's really significant. Paired with the role of media becomes really hugely important. And it can be understated, but like, the narratives that we hear all the time about something like politics is that it's also very exciting, right? I mean, in a regard that it's kind of like a game. So think about the language that gets used, right? Red versus blue, who's winning, all these kinds of things. And at the kind of basic level, it's really rooted in this question of how do we want to govern ourselves as a collective people, right? But it's been kind of intensified in certain ways that I think are sometimes detrimental. Especially when we think about something like civil discourse then, is it's really hard to step into a space, especially if now I'm a conservative, and these are a bunch of liberals, or you are this, and I'm that, those kinds of challenges. Without that sense of expectation, right, it's really important for us to be able to kind of be in an environment, again, that sense of space, where we can wrestle with ideas reasonably, kind of logically, and also with passion, but with some ground rules of expectation of how we're actually going to be, and that can be one response to that. But a major factor that it has kind of exacerbated is that we have kind of chosen to live in and now are reinforced in kind of the views and ideas that are grounded in the things that we prefer. And it's a real hurdle. There are some really explicit efforts to kind of overcome that. So something like All Sides, for example, if you're interested in kind of politics and news, is a great resource. It lays out kind of left, right, and center of political issues. So whatever the news of the day is, you can look at, and it's got this interesting algorithm, and you can also peg, you could say, I'm slightly center-left, and so when I read things, I can say, oh yeah, that's center, that's left, right, center, whatever it might be, and then it would allow you to see kind of the breadth of how people view issues, which is one among many tools trying to kind of, I think, respond to this, the ease in which we exist in a way that we don't even know that there's a bigger world than just that piece we see. That's a great question. Thanks.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I know you say you do something with the state legislature.
Yeah.
So do you see it able to change from the state level, than on the national level? Because when you watch national news, it's like, man, they can never get together. I'm curious are you seeing a change on the local and state level in Kansas?
Yeah, so did people hear mostly that question? I can paraphrase. I mean, so working with legislators and the differences between kind of local and national politics, right? I think is a slightly more succinct way. I would say yes for a variety of reasons. One is that local politics, especially like really local, like a city or a county, whatever it might be, it gets deeply practical really fast, right? So you're asking a question about, we're going to raise our sales tax this % for these roads, for these kids to get to school, right? Or whatever those kinds of things are. National politics, gosh, I feel really weird saying this with you sitting right here. Because you host national politicians and all sorts of things. It's very important, and at the same time, it's kind of abstract, right? It's hard to grasp your mind around a lot of the questions that are going on there. It's really important from a big kind of shift of like what are our big notions of politics and our shared life. But when we zoom it in to the local level or the state level, it becomes kind of applied in different ways and at a kind of a grassroots level. And so in Kansas, One of the biggest champions of this has been, in Kansas we have, we kind of refer to them as three parties. We have the Democrats, Republicans, and the Conservatives. And the Democrats don't really matter because they're so small, so it's really around the moderates and the conservative Republicans. This work has been trying to happen for about 6 years, and it hasn't. For a variety of reasons. But they saw, and part of this goes back to a shift of who's literally elected in office and open, willing to kind of engage some of these questions. But they have stepped into a place to where they say, we recognize we have some real serious issues and we need to be able to work across, so not just these two, but these three, truly, these bodies, in a constructive way, which is what's going on. And why it's important, I'll note this, is that a very high percentage of local elected officials, especially at the state level, will go on to national office in Congress. And so part of the rationale behind this project, it's called Next Generation, if you're interested in it, is it's happened in 17 states. A number of them have kind of implemented these practices. A lot of them go on. I'll point to one very quickly, though, in Maine. Very famously, they had a governor who was very confrontational with the members of the House and the Senate. And so they found ways to work together to the point that they said, you know what, something that's not working, I'll use this as a way to visualize this. What's one phrase? What is this thing? Oh, stairs, yes, very good. You guys are very smart. What else might it be? A walkway? Okay, you're all saying the word I'm not thinking of. Aisle, yay, good job, thanks. I'm glad that we didn't go any longer than that. We always say working across the aisle, right? And we literally mean that, of like, do you know how people sit in like Congress, for example, right? I'm this party, I'm over here. I'm this party, I'm over here. In Maine, they said, you know what? Part of our challenge is that we just keep reinforcing this narrative that they're there and I'm here and this is just what it is. So they changed how they sit. So they don't sit by party. They just sit interspersed. So what happens, right? All of a sudden, now I'm sitting beside you. I may be radically different from you in my politics and what I'm choosing to do, but I'm literally sitting beside you, and I'm being reminded that, oh my gosh, you're a human, right? You have families and values and the things that you believe in and care for, and you're not just, even if we're going to come down and we're going to have a vote and we're going to come out differently, I can still see the kind of humanity in that. And that's, for me, a big piece of this idea of kind of deliberative dialogue, is that I recognize what I think is not always going to happen, right? But if there's a process that's fair and inclusive, that allows the kind of the various viewpoints to be heard and expressed and wrestled with, and then we come to this place of resolution, that's radically different than just saying, 51% of this, right? Who's up or down? I teach a small group communication class. We talk about the different ways we can make all sorts of decisions. It's really easy to just say how many people are in this room and then what's one more than half. It's another thing to say, let's work through the question, whatever it might be, for time and efficiency, all this kind of stuff. But you can begin to say why it's different if you're that 49%. It's a really frustrating process. That's basically what we see in politics. This is a different way of thinking about politics. Basically, if we had the worst potential system to set up, it'd be what we have, right? It'd be about a slight majority always winning. It'd be about this really kind of confrontational frame, all this kind of stuff. What I'm talking about tonight is really acknowledging some of this and saying, how do we embed within some of that these kind of deliberative democratic practices, but also think about a lot of the other spaces where we show up. What does it mean to democratize a classroom? What does it mean to change your residence hall? What does it mean to think about the ways that we're interacting between the university and the community, for example? How do we not just show up as kind of the experts, but how do we think about it as a relationship? Those kinds of things, I think, become really important, which is a long way back to your sense of the role of local officials, is that if we have those practices stepping into those formal structures, I think we have the potential to influence and affect the many other entities that would look and kind of be experienced in similar ways. Great question. Thank you. Yeah.
So you mentioned how we got to the polarization.
Uh-huh.
How do you think we could get back to kind of reconnecting again and coming to common ground?
Okay, so the question of like how do we get to this place, and then a sense of how do we come back to common ground. Interestingly, Not long after all those discussion projects from the 1930s and 40s, famously in the early 1950s, a group of political scientists said, our two major parties are too similar, we need a lot of difference between them. 1951. And during that period, the concern was that we were all in this mushy middle, that we didn't have enough of the range of perspectives on a topic, and that was really detrimental. I think we've taken that somewhere out these doors, right? It's not even just kind of this extreme way. And so the sense of kind of, I think as you said, kind of moving back in some ways is, I think, both helpful and also acknowledging that doesn't mean, to something I said, right, conflict doesn't disappear. So the ability for like bipartisanship, if we think about Congress, or collaboration if we're thinking at a more local level, becomes an essential piece that is not devoid of some of those tensions, right? I still want you to show up with the things that you care about to be able to express that and articulate that. I may have my own set of things. It's really important to say, how do we actually institutionalize some of these practices to where you can actually say those things. I can too. We can wrestle with a whole host of this in a way that is not dehumanizing people too, right? I mean, there are certain parameters, right? This is why ground rules become really important. We can't argue that you shouldn't exist as a person, for example, right? But within some of those boundaries, we need to be able to kind of deal with those thorny issues. We refer to them as wicked problems, right? It's opposite of technical issues. If the light goes out down the street, it's not easy to fix, but there's a technical fix, right? We the guy with the crane and do the thing. Wicked problems are inherently complex. We can do one thing, we can try to ameliorate it, and something else is going to happen. There's going to be a trade-off, right? So back to that sense of tensions and trade-offs. Being able to wrestle with those ideas is fundamental. That's where this kind of deliberative mindset becomes really, really important. So to your, in a fairly succinct way here, is how do we do that? Is, I think, not just listening to some guy on a Monday night talk about these things, but actually practice these things. And that's part of my hope and the real desire is that how do we think about these institutions, and universities are one of these examples, that how can we learn about these ideas, how can we kind of put them into practice, and so it just kind of seeds out in that way. That it's not just locked into thinking about politics in these formal roles, but thinking about politics as everyday life. Anybody else? Maybe time for another question or two? Yeah.
Regarding that idea of considering both sides, what do you think about the frequency issue where some people are protesting against?
Yeah.
And, they may get even more upset on their side because they don't think they're being heard. On the other side, they're going to say, well, that, there's no reason we should not consider both sides because maybe, that side strongly believes the other side is not ethical. And so if we take sort of a neutral position and then you're going to try to listen to both sides, people think that you're a harmful person.
Yeah. So to paraphrase this, the tensions between free speech, the opportunities to speak, when it bumps up against that sense of maybe identity, or even if you should exist, kind of worth as a person, those kinds of things. Is that what you're referring to a little bit? So, and what's your name?
Daphne.
Daphne? Okay. Thanks, Daphne. So Daphne said something very interesting, and I want to point this out before I respond to this. You notice how she talked about it? I don't want to turn you into a moment here. Both sides, super easy to do. Do you think there are two sides? This is a big question. Maybe, but maybe not, right? There's a lot of questions that we might want to think about the complexity of. And so one thing I want to highlight here is that part of thinking about this role of discourse becomes really helpful, that maybe we step back from this, you're either this or you're that kind of framing. And everybody does it. I do it all the time, right? It's just a moment to capture it. But I think it speaks to the bigger issue, especially for college campuses, is how do we maintain and value viewpoint diversity and at the same time respect and value the sense of inclusive communities and what that means. And so I didn't catch your name before. Joseph? So when Joseph's question to me actually connects a lot to this, is when we set some sense of expectation of those parameters of what is going to be, what is acceptable, what's not. And part of the challenge is, I'm in a public institution, and so we have this playing out right now of basically it's without violence, anything is permissible, right? It's just almost anything goes, which is not really very constructive, right? And so what I'm pointing to is how do we have these kind of thoughtful, more kind of constructive discussions? And so figuring out who are these actors, as was being raised, and what are the viewpoints to where we can think about these questions, not just in a, let's let this group kind of, we have a plaza, right, in front of our student union, which is where this always happens, right? So it's not just who gets to have the 2 hours on Wednesday to kind of shout their perspective. You can do that, right? I think that's important to an extent. But what to me is more significant is how do we actually have, and I don't have the ability, I don't want to go back slides here, but that one where I have those 4 kind of quadrants, this is where kind of that conflict transformation becomes really important. So something called intergroup dialogue has been used around issues of racism, sexism, and the like, to a place to where people are in a sustained conversation able to come to understand some of these issues. And it's not necessarily that you're going to walk out the end of the day and change your kind of mind on it. Famously, there was a group, there were a number of bombings at women's health clinics in Massachusetts, and basically the advocates for and against said this is too much, we need to do something else. And so for about 2 years they had an underground conversation literally in the home of a person who helped facilitate this. They eventually founded something called Essential Partners. And they came out and made a very public statement. Right, so here you had this issue that was deeply divisive around pro-life, pro-choice, and the role of abortion and women's health, all these questions, and they came out and made a statement. They didn't change their views on the topic. The group of people who were opposed to it still held that opposition, and those in support, right, either way, however you want to think about the topic. But what they did do, and this is maybe the takeaway, what they did do is say that I've come to understand why, and that literally they would refer to kind of each other, why they hold some of these views. And that's not always applicable for everything. I would argue that to be democratic requires that we don't exclude people from those conversations. So if I say you are not worthy, you are not human, or those kinds of things, you're not playing by the rules, and so you're somewhere out of bounds. And so we need to be able to kind of wrestle with those tensions. But that's where it gets really hard and really tough in figuring out what does it mean to have the opportunity to speak and that expectation of us being a community. And for a university, right, to really wrestle with that sense of who we are in all of that kind of diversity and that range of perspective and experience. And so that was a long way to sort of answer your question. But you're highlighting, and that resource that I did mention a few ago, I will go back here just quickly. Oh, I thought it was closer. This one it's a free download. You can find it, the Institute for Democracy and Higher Education at Tufts. Nancy Thomas is a great one of how do we think about the sense of free expression and inclusion as it relates to the sense of kind of open ideas. Thank you. Are we? All right. I'm getting the cue, so I'm going to pass it on. I just want to say one more time, thank you very much for being here. I've really appreciated your attention and your questions, and I'm happy to chat with anybody if you have anything kind of afterwards. I'll be down here, okay? Thanks a lot. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. On behalf of Winthrop University.
Yeah, thanks a lot.